Okay. All right, did that let you know I'm recording? Super. And would anyone like to be my co-host to let folks in if they come in after I get started?
I can help you, Britta.
Thanks, Lauren. I will make you my co-host. All right. All right, well, thanks everyone for being here. This session is specifically about assessment validity. As you might have seen, we did other conferences specifically on assessment because it's one of the more challenging things to get all of the dimensions in there with NGSS. As teachers shift from traditional assessment, where it's really just lots of questions related to content, it takes a lot of work to get the cross-cutting concepts in there, to make sure that you're targeting the exact science and engineering practice and the performance expectation. And interestingly enough, like in my journey working with people, we had a lot of 3D assessments, and after using screening tools, we figured out later on that the piece that was missing most frequently was actually the phenomena, the transfer to a novel phenomena. So I share this information with you to just share with you that that was really like a challenge with a lot of the people that I've worked with and in my own journey. And hopefully this is helpful for giving you information about how to make the best assessments possible. And we'll link everything that we talk about today to, if you've been to conferences before, tools that you have already seen. And if you haven't seen them, I'll do my best to try to catch you up and share information with you. So our objectives for today are, we want to identify components of assessment validity. And these are things that are true on a math assessment, on an English assessment, possibly on like a PE assessment. So anytime that you're assessing students, these are general assessment validity things. And then which parts of the assessment are actually supporting sense making. And sense making, when we talk about it, I'll use the same 4 components that we started with today. So the practices, the phenomena, the student ideas, and the science ideas. I think it's really hard on a paper assessment for the student ideas to be there in terms of the collaborative piece, but the more that you can do group projects, the more that you'll see that, as long as your projects allow you to like get information about what each student knows. So here we go. As a teacher, have you ever noticed that after you gave an assessment, you collected evidence on more than what the standard was asking for? So you've given an assessment, you're grading, and you're like, ooh, I think I accidentally made this harder, or I went beyond what my students needed to know, or I accidentally collected evidence on something that the standard wasn't asking for at all. Has it ever happened to you? Would anyone like to share an example? I have one, a stock example. I'll share mine. So when I used to use the McCarthy standards for middle school science, and my transition into NGSS, like many, it started with like, well, let me just kind of figure out how the content fits with the new stuff. And then later I added the practices. And then a couple of years later, I was like, oh my gosh, I have no cross-cutting concepts in here. So as I was adjusting in the part of my process where I was starting to look at the skills, I noticed like, oh, there's not a lot in the energy unit on like data and like mathematical analysis. And from the McCarthy standards, I was still having my students calculate energy with formulas, which is not part of the middle school standards. So that was one of the things where, as I got deeper in my process with NGSS and I was moving from McCarthy into NGSS, I realized that I was testing students above what they actually needed to know. And another thing I noticed is when I was giving word problems or scenarios and having them write it out, for my students in Colombia, most of them are native Spanish speakers, but they've been immersed in an English environment for a really long time. I was kind of giving them a writing test, just because to take your science ideas in your brain and then write them in an English paragraph, you're kind of testing their English too. All right, now flip to the student side. So as a student, have you ever felt like in a class or on an evaluation that you put in effort, that you studied, but that the way that your teacher tested you or assessed you made it hard for you to show evidence of learning. Has that ever happened to you? Would anyone be willing, now that we're talking about being a student, to share one of those examples? I saw some nods, so I know that you know what I mean. Juan Martin, you're giggling.
Is that I think that would happen a lot in my first year, since I'm like science was a new thing for me. I was mostly math, so like understanding the standards and like what to do and what not to do. I think it was a learning experience that first year. So there was a lot of things that I feel like I did that where students were having a lot of difficulty by the end of the unit. And it was like really tough for them. So I had to start like looking into my units again and like made modifications to it. Like it's my third year and I feel it's changed so much since then. But overall, I think that first year for me was really tough for the majority of my units.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing. So assessment validity, it's tricky for teachers to get a handle on it because you have to really like be highly standards literate with NGSS, and those performance expectations, they take some work and they take time. And thanks for sharing, Juan Martin, and being vulnerable in that way. I still find things like I've been working with NGSS for 7 years now, and I still find nuance every time I deeply read the standards and prepare assessments. So the idea is not that you have to be perfect. It's just that you grow in your noticings of what the performance expectations look like. And the cool thing is I don't have a classroom of my own, but sometimes the teachers notice things with the screening tools from older assessments that we've made. And they're telling me like, hey, you didn't notice this in this assessment that's in the curriculum. And that's a cool place to be. So take a moment to just read this quote. Okile's a very inspiring person around learning and science. So this is just our quick, like, why are we here? We're here because we have to make better assessments with NGSS because we're no longer just assessing students on the things that we used to in science. We're not just assessing them on how they receive settled science. We're creating new assessments because we really need them to construct it. And if our assessments are still old school, even though our pedagogy is changing within the classroom, there's going to be a lack of alignment. So you might have to throw out some of your old assessments, and sometimes it is easier starting over. Like I said, when I was taking my old assessments and trying to modify them for NGSS, they just had a lot of stuff that wasn't working anymore. And I was doing things that were invalid. I was testing my students on things that were no longer relevant to the NGSS performance expectations, even though they were with McCarthy. So these are 4 things that are important in assessment validity, not only for NGSS. When we talk about assessment validity, what we're talking about is we want to make sure that we are measuring what we are supposed to measure, because assessments are meant to measure learning. So the first one is really, you want to make sure that whatever your standard or your performance expectation says, that you look at the hierarchy and the content level. So I'll show you what this means in the context of an NGSS performance expectation in a moment. But if it says recall, you don't want to have your students generate something original because that's not a verb match. Or if it says that they need to understand the relationships between variables in energy, that's not the same as solving with an equation. So you got to make sure your verb and your content hierarchy matches the level of your students, and that is directly from the standards. The second one really has to do with student ideas. We talked about this in the opening session, modality. So we want to make sure that we allow students a variety of ways to show that they can do whatever verb it is within the standard. A lot of times standards don't specify that something has to be written or spoken or acted out or modeled. So if it doesn't have that specificity, you can allow them to change the modality. And by doing so, that's going to give them lots of choices or opportunities to show what they know without being confined to, for example, writing. If you don't want to test your students on writing, then maybe don't put writing in your assessment format. Maybe ask them to do it verbally or create a model or something else that's related to the standard. If you were in Matt's session today, or if you'll be in it tomorrow, language is huge, especially because most of us work in schools where we have multilingual learners. So if the first language of your students is Spanish, think about if there's a way that you can help leverage that, because you could be giving them a complex English test if you're having them write an essay with technical vocabulary when really they're supposed to be modeling. So again, make sure that what you're asking them to do isn't just testing them on complex academic vocabulary in English when that's not what the science standard is asking. And then the final one that can really help with the validity is anything that motivates or is more authentic to your students will create more valid assessments as long as they're still aligned with the standards. So if you can have them doing something that is relevant, if you can use problems and scenarios from the real world, phenomena is obviously one, like without a doubt, it's more authentic because you're using things that are observable in the real world. And if you can extend that to the engineering parts of NGSS, where they're also designing solutions and working with problems that they can find in the community, those will also help your validity. Because an unmotivating traditional test or just a assessment that is boring, that can also be a threat. In that case, you end up measuring how interesting your assessment is. And that can kind of show a downward trend if you're giving a lot of assessments that are overly traditional. Traditional is not a bad word, but students need variety, and especially depending on the age group, it can be hard for them to sit through, a 45 question exam or something at this point, if you're in the upper levels. Okay, so if we're looking at something really specific from NGSS, this is a 3rd grade physical science standard. So if we're looking at the verb hierarchy and the content hierarchy, if you go on the NGSS website, one of the most helpful things is this red text, which is the assessment boundary and the clarification statement. So here it says, ask questions to determine the cause and effect relationships of electric or magnetic interactions between two objects not in contact with each other. So this is saying ask questions. So basically my assessment has to have them asking questions. Otherwise, if I'm having them write an essay on cause and effect, I'm out of the verb hierarchy. I've gone beyond it. And in terms of the content hierarchy, we're talking about electric and magnetic interactions between objects not in contact with each other. This is going to tell us assessment is limited to force produced by objects that can be manipulated by students. So what does that mean? What can be manipulated by students? Things that you can have them look at in the classroom. So perhaps like actual magnets in your classroom, perhaps a balloon with their hair. So simple things that they can actually interact with and touch. And it does say electrical interactions are limited to static electricity. So you're not having them build a circuit to prove that they can do this standard. So when I say verb, we look to the science and engineering practice. In this case, it's asking questions. And if I say content, we're talking about electric and magnetic interactions. Or non-contact interactions, and that's our content hierarchy. For modality, this says nothing about modality. How can you ask a question? You can write it or you can say it. So if you're making your students write it and they could say it, but you're marking them down, you could have a validity issue there. For language, there's a couple things you could do here. If you can allow a student to tell the question in a different language, if you're bilingual, that's one option. If that's not an option for you, but you know that your students are Spanish speakers, the difference between questions in English and Spanish, the intonation of your voice, the punctuation, the structure, they're very different. So it can really help if you scaffold that. What I mean by that is, like, if I do this lesson in a 3rd grade classroom and I ask students to ask a question and I don't give them a scaffold, a student will raise their hand and say, like, the balloon sticks to my head. Okay, that's not a question. So I might need to have them use a structure like, okay, we're going to ask questions. So you need to start with what, where, how, if, do. So a scaffold for asking questions is you give them the words that the questions start with. And if you know that it's a cause and effect question, you might give them a scaffold where it says the word cause or effect in it. What is the cause of, or how does blank affect blank? So giving those sentence stems will help them ask a question that's targeted. And that could perhaps be in your formative assessment. It doesn't have to also show up in your summative assessment. So we've gone through verb, content, modality, and language, and then authenticity and motivation. There's so many things that you can have students interact with and touch. So if we're talking about static electricity and you have balloons in your classroom, it's going to be much more motivating to have them actually working with those materials than just like watching a video of it or reading about it from a textbook. So that's how you can increase their motivation, is really just by giving them the space to explore that more. And you'll be surprised, their questions will be better if they're doing it in the classroom and they're really excited about it than compared to if they're reading it in a textbook or watching someone else do it on a video. Is there anything at this point that I could clarify about what these 4 general assessment validity areas are? There's some overlap too. Okay, super. Okay, so what do you do? It sounds like some of us may have been in this situation. If you discover that an assessment is poorly designed, if you have threats to validity in your assessment, it doesn't mean you have to throw the assessment in the trash, but it does mean that if you are going to externally report what a student knows, and you find that your assessment wasn't a great assessment because you accidentally made them do formulas when they weren't supposed to, or because you realize that the English level of writing an essay was too hard, you probably want to use that as feedback for yourself and be careful about what you externally report, because assessment validity is a teacher's responsibility at the end of the day, but also have grace because it can take years to make a really good assessment. So just take a moment to reflect back to the beginning and think about one of those assessments where you discovered something later, or when you were a student and you were like, man, I really studied for that. I really thought I had it and it didn't work out. So it's not that you have to feel bad about it. It's not that you have to throw all of the evidence away. Use what you can, but be careful. And with each assessment that you give, really dig deeper into what your students need and what the standards say so that you can create more validity. All right, so how does this relate to sense making? I'm going to try to help us use a tool that we've used in other conferences so that you have a takeaway from this session that you can look at with your own assessments or assessments from your team. So NSTA says that the 4 areas or the 4 components of sense making are the use of novel phenomena, centering student ideas, engaging in the practices, and then putting scientific ideas to work. All of the 3 dimensions are covered within NSTAs. They're a little bit less explicit about the cross-cutting concepts, but they're there within the science ideas. So don't forget about them. They are the forgotten dimension of NGSS. Something that we love and have used in many sessions for the conference is this 3D assessment screener. It's found for free on wonderofscience.com. The author is Paul Anderson, who's a very renowned NGSS consultant who used to be a teacher. We love it because it's simple, but it does require you to look at a standard and know what the 3 dimensions are. And there's also 2 levels of depth. So for example, if you look at the first 5 questions, there's a little dotted line here. If your assessment doesn't pass a yes or a partially on the first 5, you don't want to move into the next ones because these are really going to be a highly valid assessment. And how do you use this? If you have an assessment before you give it to your students, use this assessment screener, take your assessment and make sure that you're at least hitting the first 5 for validity. Now, crossing this over with sense making, the first thing that we need to have in sense making is phenomena. This screening tool for any assessment has 4 areas that are related to phenomena. So the very first thing it says is that the assessment contains a phenomena or a problem. So you don't pass go if your phenomena is not there. And this is why we needed the screening tool much earlier in many of the situations that I've worked in and for my own assessments. Down here in level 2, it says the prompts point in the direction of explaining a phenomena or designing a solution. So whatever this phenomena is in number 1, your prompts are asking students to explain it or get towards explaining it, because explaining may not be the exact practice that students are being asked to do. It also says that it's authentic, interesting, and requires students to figure something out. So you can't just tell them how it works. They've got to figure something out. And then the last one is that it's a novel phenomena. So it can't be the same phenomena that you started the unit with. You're not going to evaluate them on the same thing that you use as your hook or as your anchor phenomena, because then there's no transfer. So you're going to use a unique phenomena in order to do that. So that is how phenomena, this part of sense making, shows up in our classic assessment screener. The next one is science ideas. So this is your DCIs, which is the content. So your prompts or your evaluation needs to elicit an observable understanding of the disciplinary core idea. So if we're thinking back to the electrical or magnetic interactions from objects that aren't touching, you have to make sure that there's something in your assessment that's getting at that content. And our cross-cutting concept back there, it was cause and effect. So it's pretty easy to tell if you use the words cause and effect within your assessment that you've got the CCC in there. And then in terms of science ideas, because many of the phenomena or the things that we use are coming from settled science or coming from other authors, this is basically just making sure that it is scientifically accurate, so that as they're building science ideas, it's connected to something that's real. So that's the second area of sense making and how it is embedded in this screener. The third area is the practices. So those show up 3 times. So your prompts match the science and engineering practice. Again, that sounds like if the prompt is asking you to, your students to ask a question, that doesn't mean you're evaluating them on modeling, explaining, arguing, finding evidence for. You just go to the level. Your prompt needs to match the level of the practice that's in the performance expectation. And they need to have enough in the assessment to be able to utilize the SEP. So you want to make sure that they can do it multiple times within the assessment, or you want to make sure that there's different phenomena that they're working with in order to have enough information to fully make a claim or find lots of different evidence or analyze data or ask different questions. And number 7 is basically like, does the format of your assessment, does the way that it's organized give them space to do that in an observable way? These evidence statements are also found on the NGSS website. Those were something super helpful for teachers in my context. They are like a way of checking that the depth of your assessment goes to the right level, and they can also help you create rubrics. We don't have time for that in this session since it's a quick one, but you can find an evidence statement for every performance expectation on the NGSS website. The last one is the student ideas. So student ideas, like I said, this really depends on your assessment. You always want your assessment to be able to give you individual information about a student's process, but the nature of science is really collaborative. So as long as your instruction and your class time has that, it should transfer all of the evidence they've found, all of the discussions that they've had. It should transfer the knowledge into your evaluation. So you wouldn't want to have an assessment where they can't rely on any of that collaboration and that building off of student ideas that you had in class. And there's not a great place for this, but I do think the way that you set your assessment up, if it's on paper or in a rubric, that it gives them space in order to observe things that they saw in class, things that they heard others say, and things that they learned throughout their process. So again, this tool, it's Paul Anderson's assessment screener. It's found for free on the Wonder of Science website. And we don't want sense making to feel like another thing that you have to learn for NGSS. We want to try to connect it to what you have already seen. So again, if this is your first conference, perhaps you haven't seen it, but this is one of the single most powerful tools that you can find, and it has that sense making right in there. So this was a quick session, but our objective today were to identify the components of assessment validity. So if you can think really quick, I mentioned 4 of them, open up the chat and just name one of those components of assessment validity. Yep. So your verb hierarchy. Thank you. Anybody else have one on the tip? Yep, language. So making sure you're not accidentally giving a language test. Thanks, Brooke. Modality. So if they can say it, why have them write it? If they can model it, why have them make an essay, and so on. There you go. So those are components of assessment validity in general. And then the components that support sense making, those are here. I don't want you to try to just recall them since this is new, but I want you to tell me as your exit ticket, what is the one component that you will identify within your assessments, either using this tool or something else? So I'll name those again. Those 4 components are phenomena. So will you use a tool or will you double check your assessments to make sure that they heavily rely on phenomena? Will you focus on the science ideas, making sure that the cross-cutting concepts and the content come through? Will you focus on the practices, making sure that you have prompts and proper hierarchy for the practices that the performance expectations are asking them to do? Or will you try to make sure that all of the student ideas that you're building through sense making in class are something that they can leverage in your assessment? So go ahead and drop your personal intention for what you're going to look for in your assessments into the chat. And with that, we'll say goodbye. So it can either be phenomena, student ideas, science ideas, or practices. All right, awesome, everybody. I hope you have a restful night. I look forward to being with you all tomorrow. Some of you are presenting tomorrow. Excited for that. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Thanks, Britta.
Bye. Thank you.